I can't believe it, but I think this is the 46th of our webinars, and we've been doing this for almost 4 years now. And this is a funny title, but apparently it was interesting to you because a whole lot of people signed up. Um, I've been having these kind of conversations with myself in a way over the last year or two, and but before I get into it, I want to just highlight what we're going to do next next time. We're going to skip December because a lot of people are busy, including us. But I'm really excited because we're going to kick off 2025 with a dialogue between me and Ian, my senior associate, who is here. I can see on the in the group, and we're going to talk about our coaching approach. And it's a methodology and a program that's been out there for quite a few years in a number of companies. And we're kind of getting ready to relaunch a completely virtual version of it. But what is different about it, as far as we can tell, is that it really focuses on accomplishments or the valuable contributions that people are expected to make. It's not like an open-ended thing. And so we want to talk a little bit about, and we're going to have sort of a dialogue about what's so great about it's being accomplishment based. So mark that on your calendars. You can, of course, if you're already signed up and registered, then for future ones, you'll get the email. If you're not, you can go to our homepage at performancethinking.com or sixboxes.com and register. But as I was going to say, I've been thinking about this for a long time. And, I started out as a scientist, not as Albert Einstein, of course, but when I was a child, for some reason, he was my hero, even though I didn't really know that much about him. But what I always thought about science, was that it was a way of finding stuff out. And I wound up being a behavior scientist, and I was a student with B.F. Skinner. And so that led me to be kind of somebody interested in discovering things. But then, over the years, as we developed this performance thinking stuff, it sort of it's like became a Jedi Knight. And here's two of my favorite people, Luzmar and Gina, who at the time were both working at Amgen, which is our longest, biggest client for our performance thinking practitioner program. They've certified well over 300 people around the globe to do performance thinking projects, large and small, at Amgen. And Gina has now moved on to another smaller biotech company where she's sort of starting it up again as director of quality. But this was one of our summer institutes some years ago, and these two ladies are so accomplished and so extraordinary and have done so many projects that we decided to have some fun with it. And what was really fun about it was I brought those swords. I thought, oh, these ladies are Jedi Knights because we'd talked about it. They brought the T-shirts, and neither of us knew we were planning this. But anyway, there's when you get really experienced with this thing, you start to feel almost like you can sort of do magic. And so then lately I've been feeling more like a wizard, and there I am on Halloween this last year, but a few weeks ago. But this whole performance thinking thing is more than a methodology. And so that's the thing I want to sort of talk with you about. I want to share some things here, which are, it's not a typical how to do it thing. It's more about insights that I've gotten, frankly, in looking at my own work, but also some folks who've been doing this stuff for a decade or, many years. And so if I think about it, if I think about the background as a scientist, hardcore natural science is based on first principles. It's based on key discoveries and principles, whether it's physics or chemistry or Skinner's behavior science, and typically is simple and elegant. It's a way of looking at the world in an analytical framework that allows you to understand stuff. And having been really fortunate to have been B.F. Skinner's science, I came to appreciate that his science, unlike the social sciences, was a natural science, and it was simple in many ways and elegant. And as such, it was built for discovery. And so later, when I discovered Gilbert's performance engineering in a book that many of you are familiar with, I think, Human Competence, and Gilbert had done a postdoc for a little while with Dr. Skinner, I realized that his work, when he first introduced it, was also elegant and brilliant, but it helped start the field of human performance improvement, or then called human performance technology, and it got kind of complicated. And so when I got involved originally in the performance improvement world, which was in the very early 80s, there were a lot of models around, and I'll show you some of those, but it was complicated. And when I reflect on what we've been doing now for really since about 1990, with this work that has come to be called performance thinking, I realize that we've been getting simpler and easier to understand and apply in many, many ways. And I don't want to seem arrogant, but as I look at our work and I look at the brilliant performance improvement folks that are out there in the world who are not necessarily using our approach, each of whom usually has some combination of models and tools that they use. What I think, not to be too arrogant about it, but what I think is what we have is a kind of a next generation version of performance thinking because of the simplicity that we've been able to develop over the years. It's basically been distilled and refined to a simplicity that really is first principles thinking. So this is what I'd like to unpack for you over the next, whatever it is, 45 minutes, and then talk with you. Now, as I said, when I got involved in this work, in the early 80s, and a lot of you are from this world, I see Scott and I see some other folks who are really knowledgeable about performance improvement. Um, what I recognized was that there's a lot of different models. And when I was fortunate because in the 80s, 90s, and pretty much early 2000s at the most, all the thought leaders, Gilbert, Rumler, Don Toasty, Dale Brethauer, the list goes on. They were all alive and doing stuff and publishing things and giving presentations. And they all had these models. And the models were brilliant. They were helpful. They're kind of like, which model do you use? And then at some point, and I think Roger Addison might have had something to do with this. I don't remember the details. But at some point, it all got put together into the Human Performance Technology HPT model, which was on the International Society for Performance Improvement website for many years. And it's kind of complicated. My silly comment about it is it's the everything, including the kitchen sink model. And I think many of you have probably heard me say that. But what I'm struck by as you look at it, that it's everything you'd ever want to do. But I remember early on in the 80s and early 90s when I would go to clients' organizations, there were a few of them I distinctly remember had this as a poster up in their wall. And they would say stuff like, oh man, we're trying to do this, but it's a lot of stuff. Or they'd say every once in a while, a senior executive will come through and say, wait a minute, how long is this going to take, et cetera, et cetera. And so it was complicated. It was like what Steve Jobs described many years ago, where you go from sort of beginnings where things are kind of complicated, and then you refine and they become simpler. And so I want to talk a little bit about this process of being simpler. And if you're interested, I'm not meaning to push my thing, but there was a talk I was invited to give at the Association for Behavior Analysis International a few years ago. And it was recorded. And if you want to watch it, there's the QR code to it. But what I recognized when they asked me to do this invited lecture, you can do anything you want. And I realized that all of the work that I've been involved in over about 45 years, including this work, has been really about driving simplicity. Now, let me explain a little bit more what I mean by this. I started thinking about this and started thinking about the origins of performance thinking in my own evolution, which of course are closely related. And I recognized that there are certain strategies or underlying things that affected this big time. And one of them was that Ogden Lindsley, who was a major mentor of mine and who in fact told me, he kicked me out of precision teaching and work in education, said, I want you to go into business. He talked about using plain English. When he moved from laboratory, brilliant research at Harvard Medical School to training teachers, he said, we're not going to use our behavior science jargon anymore. We're going to use plain English that people can understand. And Edward Tufte, who I never had a personal relationship with, but who was a brilliant man and who I saw in person a bunch of times for his kind of almost famous one-day lectures, he talks about visual display of information. And so those were two principles that really got introduced in this work in a certain way from very early on, from really the 80s and 90s. And then I made contact, again, quite fortunately, with Bob Horn. And Bob was the creator, inventor, if you will, of the information mapping method. And And his research back in the 60s and I guess 70s led to the creation of the information mapping company and information mapping methodology of structured writing. And there's a bunch of principles. Some of you, I think, I recognize some friends who I think have been through the information mapping training, and I highly encourage it. If you want to learn a replicable methodology for creating really, really effective user-focused documentation, go through the information mapping programs, even though they're no longer, the company was sold to a European distributor, and it's not quite the same as it used to be, but it's the same principles and methodology and tools. But there were a couple of key ideas that Bob Horn brought to the table, and two of them, there were several, but two of them were the notion of chunking and labeling. That when you have a whole lot of stuff, if you can categorize it, name the categories, and then break it down to subchunks, that it's a lot easier to digest. And it really follows the old idea that we can only sort of handle 7 plus or minus 2 things at a time. And so chunking and labeling is important. And then combined with that, in the information mapping method, was this notion of hierarchical organization, which is pretty obvious. It kind of goes together. It's the notion of a tree structure, that you have, a big chunk and you have subchunks and sub-subchunks and so forth. And that if you organize things in a hierarchy or a tree structure, again, it's easier to comprehend and understand. And then the third principle or sort of strategy that I recognized as I reflected on the work we've been doing is what I would call integration. And this really comes just from my own habit. I've often said to people that if there's a capability I have, it's mostly sorting things into clusters and naming them. I mean, whether it's cleaning up my office or getting ready to write a paper or anything else, what I tend to do is sort a whole bunch of stuff into categories and then see how those categories sequence and are organized. And there's a couple of things that can come out of that. One of them is that when you do that and when you apply those other two strategies that I mentioned above, you can come up with sets of elements that are interdependent. And you'll see, and you probably know in performance thinking, that is part of the story. And then also, if you do it effectively, you can come up with a completeness framework so you don't miss anything. So what I'd like to do is sort of talk about how elements of our work reflect these strategies. And so let's talk about, first of all, what the elements are. And everybody, I think, here knows that, the sort of a big part of our work has been has really been focused on Tom Gilbert's accomplishments. The notion that behavior is costly, and as he said in his famous book, in the Great Cult of Behavior, behavior itself is viewed as an end rather than a means to an end, but we must enable people to produce accomplishments, the valuable products of behavior. Now, right there, you've got a really important sort of mind-bending, paradigm-shifting thing that also has the effect, in many cases, of essentially tree structure of chunking and labeling. Because one of the beauties about accomplishments, if I say we're going to produce a widget or a report or anything else, it pulls along with it different tasks and tactics, clusters of behavior. So right there, you've got a chunking and hierarchical organization thing, but it's also a first principle, the notion of a framework that focuses on accomplishments. And so, as you know, I think most of you are familiar, what came out of that was our simple model that we call the performance chain, where we said, what is performance? Performance is behavior that produces work outputs or accomplishments that are valuable to the extent that they contribute to business or organizational results. And then there are behavior influences, all the stuff that supports or gets in the way of that behavior. So those are 4 simple elements or units of analysis. And, we know that we worked from the back, the end backwards. So we say, what's at stake here? What are the outputs, et cetera? And we know that it works from left to right. So we have this simple model. And even built into that, as I'll say in a couple more minutes, is a certain amount of chunking, labeling, and hierarchical organization. And it's pretty easy to remember. Many of you, most of you have been through our programs. And one of the things we've been doing the last few years is asking participants to be able to just draw out these 4 chunks, label them, and talk about them. And it gives you a really easy way to sort of hang a whole lot of stuff as you think about it. And so it's plain English. And it's a very simple graphic. And if you get rid of the examples under it, it's a really simple graphic. It's chunking and labeling because it's those four categories, if you will, chunks, and then instances or examples or aspects of them underneath. And it's also hierarchical, again, because it's bigger chunks and chunks underneath it. So already that principle emerged. And when I did this, I wasn't thinking that way. I was really just following Joe Harless and Tom Gilbert's thought process. And of course, we start out with business results. We want to know, we want to know what's at stake. If we're coaching somebody or doing a project, we say, well, why are we doing this again? Is this for, safety or organizational, productivity, or is it for revenue, or what is it? And so we can look at lots of different organizational level business results, and this is just a list that we often share with our program participants just as examples. But any organization you work in has things that they talk about and usually measure that represent the success for the whole organization. So that's where we're starting if we're doing organizational work. And then we say, okay, let's identify in whatever the hunk of performances we're concerned about, the work outputs or accomplishments and the behavior that produces them. And again, right there, you've got a sort of a hierarchical thing because you've got outputs, and for each output, you've got usually a list of tasks or tactics. And so in that framework, the outputs are really what we're focused on. And so as you know, and we have a world expert here, Therese Longo, on this one because her company develops job profiles using this tool that we created years ago, the individual performance map. But here you've got a job, the chief learning officer, and all of the outputs or accomplishments that role delivers to various customers. So we can find work outputs that way. And we can also look in processes. This is kind of a funky, simple process diagram, but the intention was to show a very simple process where you have the steps, which are the behavior, and then you got the outputs, like the first version of the PowerPoint file, and then suggested edits, and then the second version, and so forth. And you even have a decision here, which notice decision or outputs. And then from that decision, there's a branch. And then finally, you produce the final output. So this is a really simple process, but the intention is to point out that if you're looking at a complete description of performance, you got to have the behavior, the steps, or the tactics or tasks, and you got to have the outputs. So that's simple enough, and it's guided really by that performance chain model. And out of that, we can do things like, for example, Tom Gilbert talked a lot about exemplary behavior analysis. This was one of his important contributions. And Paul Elliott and Al Folsom have followed up on this. They have a book, which I think is its second edition, that goes deeply into this work. And the idea is if you got some superstars and you measure those superstars ultimately by their work outputs, like what are they producing? And if they're way better, like multiple times more productive than the average, let's look at those people. Because if we look at them, those top performers, we say, what are they doing that's different? And sometimes it's very small things. So we look at their behavior and we observe and we compare them to average performers. And then once we got that, we enable them. So again, the performance chain gives us a framework for thinking about exemplary behavior analysis, which was one of the more important things I think that Gilbert contributed sort of intellectually and conceptually to this work. And so then we get to behavior influences. So what do we do about that? Well, this came ultimately from Dr. Skinner. And so he had a very simple model of behavior influence, which I think was probably, even though he published it in a few papers before Behavior of Organisms, 1938 was his big first book when he laid out the research and the discoveries that he'd made in creating a new science of behavior while he was a graduate student at Harvard and then while he was a junior fellow postdoc at Harvard. And so that was very simple. It said, what is the model? Well, it's discriminative stimuli or antecedents, which set the occasion for responses or behavior that hopefully are followed by reinforcing stimuli, maybe punishing stimuli, but consequences. Very simple model. But then, as you all know, Tom Gilbert recognized that we're not white cardinal pigeons. We're not rats in a lab. And what I mean by that is that in the laboratory, in the research from which behavior science emerged, originally it was with non-human organisms, as they say. And then even eventually in the work of Lindsley and Gilbert and others, it was in the laboratory humans. And those humans were looked at individually. But in the world of in that environment, especially the response capability, the what Gilbert called instruments, and what laboratory scientists called the operanda or the manipulanda, which is a fancy Latin word, I guess, for the plunger or the key or the lever that you responded with. Those instruments were built for the organism. The researchers didn't want the response mechanism to get in the way, so they sort of ergonomically designed it so that the organisms, humans or otherwise, could respond for a long time. It wouldn't be tiring. It would be easy to do. But of course, as we recognize in our world, in what Tom called the world of work, you got software and screwdrivers and documentation systems and other people, and there's a whole bunch more things that enable you to respond as you go than just the lever or the keypad or the key. So instruments became a whole category, and it's explicit, as we know, in work environments. How jobs are designed, what the sequence is, the workflow. That's all hugely impactful, not just consequences and expectations. And then the other thing, of course, that Tom did is he turned this into two rows, and he said, the environment gives you information. He called it data that set the occasion for using instruments to do whatever it is you're going to do. And hopefully there are what he called incentives that are consequences. But the individual needs or brings knowledge, an existing repertoire, if you will. And they have what he called capacity. And by what he meant by that was individual capacity, as all of you probably know. That is, are you strong enough to be a dock worker? Have you got the right skill set to do programming, whatever it is? And then motives was the way that Gilbert talked about whether a given incentive or consequence would actually be effective for a person. Because if I don't care about the incentives available, if my motives, if I'm not interested, then I'm not going to work for that. So this was a brilliant model that many or maybe everybody in this group has seen, and it changed my life a lot. I was handed Tom's book in about 1979 or 1980 by my dissertation advisor, Eric Houghton. And I didn't pay too much attention to it until I got kicked out by Og Lindsley into the business world. And I was running fluency-based sales training programs where people had to practice kind of on their own. So they weren't in the classroom and you couldn't kind of force them to do stuff. So what we recognized is we were working down in the knowledge box. We were trying to create fluent knowledge, if you will, but and I'll turn myself back on now. But what we recognized was that if we didn't do stuff in those other categories, those guys were probably not going to practice much. And so at that point, I and the teams I was leading, yes, Patty, it will be available on our YouTube channel at performancethinking.tv. I just saw your note. And so at that point, I got turned on to the fact that if we wanted performance to actually happen on the job, we need to look at all those variables. But the trouble was, and not everybody thought of it this way, but there were a lot of folks during the 80s and the early 90s who changed the language in here, because the problem was that there were a lot of misunderstandings. And so I started training people in this approach in the mid 80s. I was working with sales trainers and customer service people and other folks, and they made a lot of mistakes. It was like they didn't really understand what the words meant. It's like data. What kind of data are we talking about here? Was it spreadsheets or what? And really, it meant the information needed to know what to do and how you were doing. Or instruments sounds like a ohm meter or a guitar or something. And so what is that? Well, that's tools and all the things that what we eventually called, as you know, tools and resources, the things we need to have in hand or available as we perform. And then incentives is not a bad word, except usually incentives suggests we know in advance that if we do this, there'll be a payoff. We get to go to Hawaii if we meet our goals or whatever it is. But the trouble is, there's a lot of consequences that are unintended, like from bad processes, for example. And there's also consequences that happen that are not laid out in advance, like incentives. They're just things that happen. So that word was kind of funky. And knowledge, where do skills go? And capacity, people confused because they thought it was organizational capacity and so forth. So I started tweaking the language, and a lot of other people did too. But I took a very kind of user testing perspective. I was very much influenced by what was going on Apple Computer at that time, who are really pioneers in the whole user testing world. And so, in about 1988, we settled on this language. And that's a picture of me in about 1988. And if you want to, and let me get out of the way here, if you want to go to uh, a webinar, record webinar on our YouTube channel, it's really unpacks how the six boxes model evolved and how we use it. That QR code will get you there. But this is the language we settled on. And we found that we could introduce it to people and they would mostly not make many category errors. And it worked. It worked really well. And so for a few years, I was struggling, as many of you know, because I wanted to give Tom Gilbert all the credit. But I said, this is a little bit different in the language, and we even used it a little bit differently. And frankly, over the years, we've come to use it quite differently than people use the behavior engineering model. More ways, I guess. But finally, in about 1990, a fellow named Tom Hogan, who was a client, he was a vice president of sales training at Dun& Bradstreet. I was struggling with this language, or with, like, it's Tom Gilbert, but you can see it's different. He said, why don't you just, you always talk about those boxes. Why don't you just call it the six boxes? So we named it in about, I think it was 1991, but I can never remember. So that's behavior influences. And I've said this a lot of times, and I don't want to make too big of a deal of it, but it makes me happy that a few years ago at the International Society for Performance Improvement Conference, Scott Wirsing, one of my longtime colleagues who learned about this stuff from us back in the early parts of the teens, he, unbeknownst to me, organized a session where they nominated and voted on the best performance model in the world. And guess what? Six boxes won. And I think the reason is because of the simplicity, because of what I'm talking about here. And here's an example of chunking, labeling, and hierarchical organization. Because if you think about the six boxes, you can say, well, there's positive stuff in the six boxes, and there's also negative stuff. We call it obstructions in the six boxes. And the categories, of course, break it down to six chunks, which are pretty easy to remember, the categories in the boxes. And then underneath them, we can list the kinds of things that sort into each group. And once you get used to this stuff, you don't always have to use the job aid. The hierarchical structure of it and the chunking and labeling make it a lot easier to use in a systematic way. So that's behavior influences. And another really important component, and this is about the integration stuff, is over the years, and it took me a while to fully appreciate this, but I think most of you who've been through our programs, and even if you haven't, you can look at this, you recognize that you can link any one of these cells, any one of these functionally defined categories of behavior influence to any other one. Like, for example, expectations, if you succeed, you better get consequences. Or you better have tools and resources that work, because otherwise it'll be harder to achieve the positive consequences. And in fact, there may be some unintended negative consequences in it. Or if you develop skills and knowledge, it will make it easier to achieve consequences. And the work that we did for years on behavioral fluency, we recognized that when we built fluid performance, it made it a lot easier to make contact with the natural consequences. So you can go through the exercise and see how every one of these is connected to everyone else. And that, I think, is a big deal. It's an integrating framework because you have to see it as a system. Now, even measurement. So I've laid out sort of the elements and tried to show you how these principles or these strategies I mentioned for simplicity and integration applied. But you can even then come out of this framework and do different stuff. For example, measurement is a big deal. And many of you know how we teach measurement. We say that how do we deal with times when only one element? Good question, Erwin. We'll get to that a little bit later when we talk about flexibility, but please raise it again if I don't address it. I'm not always paying attention to the chat box because I'm looking at my slides, but that's a really good question. We can measure business results, and the performance chain highlights that. And we think most clients are doing it. But the problem is that most business results, you're lucky to get monthly or quarterly. And so there's not very many dots on the chart, if you will. You don't really have enough data points to look at trends or variability any more frequently than maybe once a quarter or even once every 6 months. So it's fine to do it. You should do it, but they're not the best framework for decision making. And then, of course, we can measure behavior. And I look at the list here and I see there's a bunch of you all who are trained in behavior science. And you know how to measure behavior. You can count it, you can checklist it, and all that. But to actually measure behavior, you got to observe it in most cases, unless it's stuff like automatic counting of how many people come in the door and use the key to get there, that kind of stuff. But measuring behaviors and monitoring it is really powerful and important if you're trying to give feedback to people, like in a call center or a sales environment or a safety environment, or if you're trying to diagnose why people aren't producing the work outputs and trying to figure out what behavior needs to change. So that's important, but it's costly. Work outputs, we've always suggested, is kind of the sweet spot because many work outputs are tangible things. But even if they aren't, we describe them as countable nouns. They usually happen often enough so you're going to have enough data to accumulate enough data points on your line line graph, if you want to think about it that way, to be able to see trends and variability. So they're leading indicators. They also reflect the value that people contribute, remembering Tom Gilbert's comment that accomplishments are the valuable contributions. They're usually easier to monitor than behavior because you can usually count them, or at least some of them, critical ones. And we can define what a good one is, so we even know what the good ones are and what's not so good. So you can use it, look at quality and accuracy and such. And frankly, one of the things we're pushing very hard is the notion that, and this is something we learned from Joe Harless, that if we start out with outputs or accomplishments as the objectives of our training and development efforts, then we say, okay, at the end of this training module or whatever we're doing here, you'll be able to produce a widget that's properly adjusted and ready to go, or whatever the output is. It's a heck of a lot easier to measure that. It's a way better way to define performance objectives than with behavior. So the point is, these things all fall out of the performance chain model. It's not really new. And I always like to quote Bob Redeker, who was a dear old friend and colleague, and he was, I think, one of the first 2 or 3 people we certified to deliver our practitioner program, our performance consulting program, some years ago. And he also is the only person, I think, on the planet other than me who is certified to deliver both the practitioner program and our coaching program, which he used to do, especially at our summer institute. But he said, you can read it, but he said, if we can get clear with our clients about work outputs and criteria, we can do measurement easily by counting work outputs. And that was just his residuum of, at least a decade or more of experience with this stuff. And we can count them. There's a few people here who might even recognize what this graphic display is, but this is behavior. This is groups of people in a customer call center, and the dots are responding correctly on practice cards with 3 different sets of cards, and there's a few individuals in each day. And so we can measure behavior and graph it and see where it's going. Very nice growth there. We can measure outputs. These are solutions provided to customers in call center. The black ones are after our training, our fluency-based training, and the open ones are after the conventional training. So apparently didn't sustain so well if you didn't build fluency. And then business results. This is another environment, but this was a small consultant and their monthly revenue. And so you can measure all these things and you can graph them. So now let's talk a little bit about the logic of this, because we're starting to get to the point of integration. And, here we paste the 2 models together, as I usually say. We have the performance chain and we say, wait a minute, in a kind of a hierarchical way, behavior influences are expanded out into the 6 boxes. And so what we say is our logic, and we teach this as performance thinking logic or performance improvement logic, is, okay, whatever you're doing, let's be sure we know why. What's at stake here? Because that may make a difference in how we proceed. And now let's take a look at the hunk of performance that we're concerned about and identify the work outputs and be sure that they really do contribute to business results. Because if they don't, we might want to consider getting rid of them in a lean process kind of way. And once we know the outputs, it's a lot easier to go after the behavior, to observe people, to do task analysis, to distinguish between exemplary behavior and average behavior in producing those outputs. But the work outputs guide you to the behavior. And once you've identified these three things, then you're in a position, as I just was suggesting, to select possible measures. You're not going to measure everything, but you can say which of these are accessible and we can get data on and are useful. Once you know that, then you say, let's go to behavior influences. And we have a little design thinking way we approach this by saying, in any context, whether it's coaching somebody or doing a project, we want to analyze what's working to support the needed behavior to produce the outputs in each cell. We want to analyze positives and negatives. We want to then brainstorm possible ways to improve these things. And then once we've done that, we want to choose for the whole system what behavior influences we're going to implement or new ones we're going to change or what have you. And we'd ideally do that with our stakeholders or our clients. And once we do that, we implement, we measure, and we adjust for continuous improvement, which is the whole agile, iterative, you never get it quite right the first time, so let's keep working on it. And in fact, those two ladies that I showed you earlier on, the Jedi Knights, they were from Amgen, where Amgen had a thing where they added S to Addies for sustainment. And they would always go back weeks or months after an implementation and do a quick and dirty 6 boxes analysis to find out what they missed, what they could have improved. So that's the continuous improvement part. And then the whole thing with this stuff is because it's so simple. There's, as we often say, 21 plain English words and 2 pictures. You can share these. You can share these with your clients, with your stakeholders, with decision makers, with people on the assembly line, as our colleague Gordy Anderson does in his lean process stuff. And it gives you a way of thinking. And so this is kind of the punchline in the sense that this is simple enough that you can grok the whole thing. It's not like that big HPT model where it's like, I can't even remember all the stuff. You can remember these things and you can begin to flexibly work with them. And there's people in this list that I'm seeing here who do. And so what can we do with it? Well, I would say almost anything. And some of you may know, and there's a webinar on this topic that we argue, and I just published something in TD Magazine a couple months ago, suggesting that at each stage or each part of talent development or talent management, we can apply, first of all, accomplishments. We can define the accomplishments we need to hire for, we need to onboard, we need to train for, we need to coach to, and we need to make decisions about the contributions people are making. And we can apply then the 6 boxes model to optimize and improve that over time. So we can do anything in talent development with this approach. But one of the things we teach, and those of you who've been through our programs, our practitioner program, know what we think after about how many years this is, 20, 30 years of doing this, is that any kind of thing you're going to do with performance is one of 6 kinds, or maybe a mix of them. It may be about defining and optimizing a job or a role. It's about training customer service representatives or hiring them or onboarding them or coaching them. It's somehow defining that. And that's something, as I mentioned earlier, Therese Longo is in her company Radcom have made quite a dent in, because one of their areas of expertise is creating accomplishment-based job profiles. We can also do the same thing for processes. As I just suggested, we can define a process and we can be sure that we know at each step what the outputs are. And then we can drill down into whatever level of behavior we need. And then we can apply the 6 boxes ABC thing to optimize that performance. Sometimes we are just simply given the requirement to do training. And there's a lot of people in this who I know are familiar with that. We sometimes complain that we're treated, if we're training and developing people, that we're treated as order takers. But sometimes training is important, let's face it. But the thing about training is if you do it without putting those other behavior influences in place, the likelihood of application in the job and sustainment and ultimately a return on investment is much lower. So the whole logic that I just showed you a few minutes ago can apply to training too. If we say the objectives of our training are expressed as the outputs you'll be able to produce at the end of this, and we're going to arrange not just this training part, the skills and knowledge part, but we're going to be sure that the other variables, the other factors in the 6 boxes support that performance. We can do change management and implementation planning. A lot of the work that I've been involved in at times has been things like implementing new processes or change management with respect to something. And same deal. The difference, though, is, at least the way we view it, is with either of these things, implementation of a new thing or even an existing thing, or managing change, you not only have to arrange those 6 boxes behavior influences for the target performers, the people whose performance you're expecting to change, but you very often have to arrange things to be sure their managers and their managers' managers do what's needed to help them do that. So very often, implementation planning and change management is a sort of a multi-layered application of this very same logic, but it works pretty darn well. And we have a fairly obscure application, and there's an article I don't have here, but I think it's on our website in the resource library. We can define cultural values, and then how do we manage and accelerate the practice of those values? Well, the discovery we recognized some years ago when I was doing a lot of work in South Korea and some other companies that wanted to do culture change was that a given value doesn't apply the same way to everybody in most cases. So in the IT department, the HR department, and the production environment, et cetera, it might look different practicing focus on the customer or diversity, equity, inclusion, or whatever. And so we start with the outputs, the accomplishments in that job, in that process, and we say, where do these values apply? Okay, what would it look like if we were applying those? Let's arrange the behavior influences to be sure in that part of the job, in that role, in that process, people are actually practicing the values in real ways. And then finally, this is an area I've been working in since the 80s, we can, in sales, define sales at a much more fine grain level than most people do, which is what are all the small milestones or advances in a business-to-business sales process, and define those as our outputs. And then we can support, train, and coach to those. Now, my proposition is I've not found any kind of human performance that didn't somehow, what couldn't be fit into this. And when we train performance consultants, what we want to do is we start with what we call framing. Like, what kind of a project is this? Well, it's defining and optimizing a role, but we want to do the onboarding process. So maybe it combines the first two. Or it might be a role, but a change in the role. So we want to think of this also as a change management project. The point is, these 6 things guide you to going after the outputs a little bit differently. And so they're very useful. This is something that I created before we even launched performance thinking as a thing back in about 2005. And what we recognized was we could take all those types of people across the top, all the way from senior leaders to individual contributors and everybody in between. And we could take all of these things that somebody could do with performance thinking and notice that any of those people could be applying it in a variety of ways. This is not just for the performance department or HR. So that was kind of a big deal. And we sort of over the years tried to drive toward this to be sure everybody could, whenever there were folks involved in organizations we came into, whoever they were, we tried to engage them in this. So it's also because of the simple language of it, because of the plain language we got from Og Lindsley, that concept, and the simplicity of it, we can drive communication and collaboration across groups, across levels, across the usual silos. So that's a pretty big deal. So let me step back for a moment, having said all this, and I want to leave a few minutes at the end for comments and questions, including responding to Erwin's comment. I think there's some features of this. Now, what happens, one of the things in our practitioner program is we insist, and I'm a real nitpicker, and the other people who deliver the program are pretty nitpicky too. We insist that you really carefully define these things and you apply the principles carefully and precisely. And it's not easy the first time, and it may not be so easy the second time. But if you're like those 2 ladies I showed you the picture of in the beginning, or some of the people in this group, you get to the point where you get pretty fluent using these models. And certainly that's what I've observed in myself over the last few years. And I've this is what led to this talk, actually, this webinar. So first thing is, that the logic, that sequence that I described, and notice if you think about it, that sequence of starting with business results and working backwards is a prerequisite sequence, because we don't know really how we should treat the work outputs until we understand what's at stake for the business. We don't really know what behavior to look at until we know what the outputs are that they're supposed to produce, et cetera. So there's a fundamental sequential logic built into that. But this is partly the answer to your question, Erwin, which is that on the other hand, if we're not doing a project, one of the things that my friend Bob Redeker said to me years ago, and I've checked this out with other colleagues I know who do this work, probably 60% of the time when you're doing stuff as a performance improvement person or whatever your job is, if you're applying performance thinking, you're not doing a whole project with all the steps. Now, it is critical that you anchor it all to accomplishments. If you don't, forget it as far as I'm concerned, because that's the value delivered. And if you're doing that, you do need to identify the behavior, and you then go to behavior influences. So you have to use all of these elements in some way. But you can be in a meeting, for example, a colleague of mine at Fifth Third Bank years ago, when she was just part of the way through our performance practitioner program, she was in a meeting and they were talking about a job role that had recently been centralized at the bank, but there were still a lot of people who had that job title out in the branches. And these folks were all stepping on each other's toes, the central office people and the branch people. They had the same job title, and they were kind of like, oh man, we're causing trouble for each other. And she was in the meeting, and she just raised her hand. She said to me, she said, well, do we know what their work is? And what she meant by that is, what are the contributions or work outputs are they responsible for? And so they didn't have to go through a whole thing. If they just defined the outputs of the people in the branches and the outputs of the people in the central office and looked at them and said, wait a minute, we don't need redundancy here. Let's more clearly discriminate between these two roles in terms of their contributions or outputs. And that's also something that, again, I keep mentioning Therese, but the work that has been going on at Radcom, and I've coached a bunch of projects like this as well, where you have something like levels 1, 2, and 3 of some job. And it's often the case that those levels have more to do with how long people have been in the job. And so you say, wait a minute, let's do some individual performance maps and define the outputs of those 3 of people in those roles and see how they compare and pull out of them a crisper definition of what each is responsible for. We did this with HR business partners years ago, distinguishing between HR business partners and senior HR business partners who often have different outputs. So you can apply pieces of this stuff, but when you get so you're thinking about the whole thing at once, because it's simple enough to kind of visualize and think about both the performance chain and the 6 boxes model, you know how the whole machine works. And so it helps you to figure out how and when to apply it. So that's at least a partial answer, Erwin. Now, if you meant, and we can talk about this in a minute as I get to the end here, which I'm close to. If you're talking about the 6 boxes model itself, it may be that you only have to clarify expectations and everything else is okay. But my experience is that's not always the case. That usually there's opportunities in most of the cells, at least in the top 3, for making a difference. The second thing that's a feature of this is depth. And this is also in part an answer to your question, Erwin, because you can go shallow or deep. Performance chain, you can say, well, there's a whole kinds of details under these things. But even if we just remember, that we're trying to produce outputs that contribute to business results and we want to look at the behavior, even that conversation, let's say with a manager, where the manager has an aha moment where they say, oh, wait a minute, my job is to arrange conditions, that is behavior influences, so that people will behave in a way that produces the outputs. Just that rather superficial use of the model can be game changing for leaders and managers who thought they were just supposed to be the smartest guy in the team, as an example. And the same thing with the 6 boxes model. You can just get real clear that I think you need to crisp up your expectations, because we talked to some of your people and they were unclear about what they were supposed to do, and there's a lot of conflicts. You can give that message to a leader, manager, head of a department or whatever, and say, oh, wait a minute. And then they might use some of those job aids I showed you to define all of the different ways that expectations can be set. But again, it depends on the level of detail. Bill Blunt, who's been retired for a few years, but he used to, when people came to him at his company with a problem, he would say, "Can I have a couple of your hours and a few of your people?" And he'd get them in a room and he'd do, quote, a 6 boxes with them. And it wasn't the most thorough analysis in the world, but it was a heck of a lot better than anybody had ever done before. So this is a flexible thing that you can apply at different levels of depth. The third thing is, and this is a point that my old friend and colleague Kent Johnson has been pointing out for years, this is nonlinear. Even though there's a sequence that we follow in that logic, because it sort of there's a dependencies. The 6 boxes model is not linear. It's true that box one is not just a label, but if you don't have clear expectations, probably none of the rest of it will work. But you can look across the different pieces of this whole framework and you can see where there's opportunities to make improvement. And it doesn't always go in a rigid sequence. So it's a nonlinear way to look at a system and look at opportunities for improving the design of it. And so it's often a useful thought process. And this is where we get to the thinking word. Many of you know, and I usually say in our programs that in about 2000, I don't know, 12 or 13, we were working with some companies and it was kind of early days in this work. And I had several people and clients say, you're giving us some tools and methods, but what you're really giving us is a way of thinking, a new way of thinking about performance. And so as you get more fluent with this stuff and just apply it in every way you can, you literally start looking at the world through this framework. And then the last one is, and I don't want to overstate this, but I've heard it from too many people to not say it, it's potentially life-saving. In my own case, when my wife and I were raising our kids, we applied it to getting our boys to clean up the kitchen and do the dishes and all that stuff after dinner. I have quite a few people who've said, "No, you have to understand, this has made a big difference in the way I view the world and how I relate to my family or how I do stuff around the house or how, like that." So these are elements of this thing. And my question is, for some of you, is that true for you? Are you to the point where you've been thinking about it enough and using it enough? And so I want to find out. I'm going to stop here and see what you guys think. And by the way, I've set it up this time. I never did that before, but I've set it up now so that I believe we can actually speak if you want to. Yeah, you can request to speak. So the chat box is perfectly fine from my perspective, but for example, Erwin, if you wanted to go into this anymore, I think there's a way you can raise your hand and then speak if you want to. It's up to you. Or text, either way. What do you guys think about all this? And so what I want to know, Erwin, from your question is, when you say when only one element is necessary, what one element out of what did you mean? Are you still there? Okay, Patty. Well, you'll be able to watch it. It'll be in the next. It's a private message from Patty saying she has to leave, but this will show up on our YouTube channel, and you'll probably get an email that has a link to it in the next few days, probably by the weekend. So thank you. Anybody else? So, Erwin, I really would like to know what you're thinking about the one element part. Oh, Rita. Okay. Oh yeah, Rita, that's a big deal. So there's a JOBM article. You would know about this because you're a behaviorist. Journal of Organizational Behavior Management that I published a few years ago. And you can find it if you go to the articles part of our resource library at sixboxes.com or performancething.com. It's called something like integrating. I forget what it's called, but it's essentially about cultural values and performance management. And the big aha that I had in regard to that when I started looking at it, I said, wait a minute. it's very rare that the behavior for practicing something like focus on the customer or quality first looks the same in every department. So the notion was if you can get managers and leaders to define within their department, within their scope, uh, okay, well, let's see what happens in just a second. If you define the actual work at hand, and then you talk to the people responsible for it, and you say, well, quality first doesn't apply to a whole bunch of the stuff you do, but these three outputs, obviously it applies. Well, let's talk about what you have to do to practice that. And so I see you just asked to speak, and I just checked on it, so I think it should work. So I hope that's helpful, um, Rita. But I think you should be able to speak now, Erwin, because I just accepted your request. See what happens. You've joined the room. Ta-da! There you are.
Hi, I'm going to turn off my camera if I can.
Oh, well, we like looking at you, but I understand.
Okay, it's the bedroom. But anyway, uh, you know, uh, sometimes it seems to me that like if people have reached a certain threshold of capability, that they don't need all the boxes. In a sense, they're self-motivated, and when you try to give them rewards, they go, oh, "Why are you
Well,
doing this?"
okay, well, let me make a very specific comment about that. One of the things I got turned on to in the 70s by Eric Houghton when I understood about behavioral fluency, because we were all consequence people then, I realized exactly what you just said. If I can get people good at something, I don't need to give them a dollar every time they do it. They're going to feel darn good about producing the expected accomplishments.
Right,
So that particular behavior influence consequences, I don't think has to be external. And in fact, my emphasis has always been let's arrange everything else so that people make natural contact with the natural consequences. They get good enough at doing the things so they say, oh, I got another one done. So I agree with you on that one for
yeah,
sure.
what I see in organizations that I've worked in is what happens is, and stories that I hear is the organization follows some kind of logic for one or more of those boxes, and then they overshare that stuff, and people get turned off.
Yes, fair enough. I think again, there's the flexibility dimension here. And one of the things we try to do is to get people there's different applications and stuff. They're all kind of different. And it's not like a mechanical process. It's a way of looking at the thing and then depending on the culture, depending like all those factors that you're pointing to, as you get better at it, especially be more artful, you know.
Right.
But to me, what's interesting about it, though, what you said is you as an experienced person in your field, and a lot of people are always adjusting in ways to the things you just described if they're paying attention. What I think the models do, because that are of our stuff, because they're so simple, is they give you a framework to do that adjustment. You don't have to apply them mechanically. Like my old friend John Skank, who I don't think is here, but he's senior vice president of sales at Dun Bradstreet. He's my client 30 years ago, and then he became a director in our company. He's just a friend. But I remember when I introduced the 6 boxes to him, he said, "This is great." He says, "This gives me a framework for putting stuff I already know about." And that's what we found with super experienced people that they say, "Oh, okay, this is now kind of almost like a sorting bin for stuff that I know how to do, and it helps me put it together, but
The,
with
the,
subtlety."
the other thing that I see, and I kind of believe, is that at some point people develop the right mindset in different things, and it's the mindset that drives the behavior.
Well, what do you mean by mindset? This is one of my
Mindset,
favorite
for
words.
example, I've always had a mindset of trying to create value for whatever I'm doing. So I have a value mindset, and
Okay.
that drives me to perform in certain ways.
Okay.
So, and it doesn't easily fit to me in the 6 boxes. It's like a superordinate
Well,
level.
I would disagree because what I think is, first of all, there's an expectation that you have somehow that's been established so that you're looking for a certain set of things,
Right.
you prioritize. So there's a box one thing there. I would also say that you're probably fluent in box four at some things about how to apply that mindset. So I think we could drill in and understand what you're talking about in terms of the elements of the performance thinking thing, but you may not. personally need it. But how about if you're trying to establish that mindset with a group? How do you do that? You know?
Well, I think it's almost there are ways to cognitively get it in people's heads, even if they don't have that particular behavior or that class of behavior, because it tells them what to go look for.
Yes, that's true. Well, that's an expectation right there that you set for them. So
Right. There, you see the gaps
yeah,
essentially. Yeah.
absolutely. So I don't disagree with you. The reason I said that mindset to me is a favorite word is everybody uses it. I remember I don't have a lot of tolerance for a lot of the ATD stuff. And I remember going to their conference a few years ago, and every year there's a new word, and that year it was growth mindset. It's like, okay, yeah, everybody's talking about this. But I think you can analyze it into actionable things. And so I don't think we disagree. I think we just use different language about it a little bit.
But by the way, I sent you an HBR article it's called "Work as a Product" that you might find interesting.
Oh, fantastic. I'm looking forward to that. Well, we're at over the hour, and I don't want to hold you all. I see the comment from Sarah, and I just want to make a verbal comment about it too. She said, "Is there a demo video of how to facilitate a 6 boxes session?" And one of the thing, and the answer is really no. And one of the reasons is because, and this is something we try to be careful with. People use the 6 boxes model. They look at it; it's been around for years, and they look at it and they say, "Oh, piece of cake, I can do that." And you can, if you apply it just in a common sense way, if you look at it, probably better. It'll probably be a better output than if you didn't have that model, a better result. And you can look at it and you just think through, like, how are we setting expectations? Is it working or not? What tools to use, et cetera. But what we've learned over the years is that there's a lot more to it than that. And so we really do encourage people to participate in our programs. I mean, to be honest, Sarah, if you go to our YouTube channel at performancethinking.tv, just select some of the webinars. There's a ton of stuff you can learn there that will help you move forward in this. But if you really want to apply this methodology, I would say the best way in a coaching setting is to understand how to have the conversation with an individual. And in an organizational performance improvement, consulting session, it's a little more complicated than that. So I'm sorry to have to say there's no simple checklist, but even just use the model and it will help you, I think. And then sign up for our programs if you can. Speaking of which, there is the shameless commerce part of this, which is, this is not commerce, this is free stuff. But if you go to Performance Thinking TV, there's a ton of valuable stuff. People keep saying, you're giving away all this stuff for free. Well, that's because we know there's a lot more to it than that. And by the way, we do have a few study guides, which we keep meaning to crank back up and do some more. But if you want to get on our mailing list, that QR code will get there. And if you're watching this recording on YouTube, please subscribe and like and share it. And we do have a practitioner program coming up. I'm going to turn me off here on January 6th. And I know that's short notice, but if anybody wanted to go through it, you can use that QR code to get to the description of it. And we have a coaching program, as I mentioned, that sort of stopped cold with COVID because it was done in person. And we've since revised it so it's virtual, spread over some weeks. And if you wanted to know more about it, we're looking for organizations or individuals who might want to participate in a pilot of that. And then here's where you can get a lot of free stuff. So thank you, everybody. This is fun. And thanks for your input, Erwin. I think you made comments last time too, and you actually reinforced my behavior for having people talk, because I was always nervous that people were going to jump in the middle, but I think this is way better. So thank you.
But you need to give them a control to turn the camera off when they're finished.
Well, that's okay. You can probably do that though yourself. I bet you.
I can't see where.
Well, I mean, just on your computer, I bet you can turn it off, can't you? Can't you just?
Well, I'm busy with your webinar, so.
Right. Well, anyway, thank you so much, everyone. And you'll get an email, I think, with this, or you can look on YouTube probably by Saturday. It'll be up there. So thanks. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care.